When the 50-year-old electrician stepped into my living room, I thought he was just here to fix a flickering light. But what if one simple moment ignited a connection so powerful it threatened to unravel everything I thought I knew about my life? How far would you go when loneliness meets temptation? This story will take you to the edge of decisions and consequences you never see coming. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories like this one, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. A knock on the door pulled me out of my thoughts. Sitting on the sofa, I had been aimlessly scrolling through my phone, trying to tune out the hollow silence that had enveloped the house since my husband left for another one of his work trips. These trips were becoming more frequent, and so were the gaps in our conversations. I told myself it was normal, that all marriages went through phases of disconnection. But that day, the stillness felt especially oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. I rose from the sofa, padding toward the door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw the electrician I had called earlier to fix the light in the living room. He was standing there, toolbox in hand, his weathered face half shadowed by the brim of his baseball cap. I opened the door, offering him a polite smile. "You must be Mark," I said, my voice cracking slightly from lack of use. "That's me," he replied, his smile easy and unforced. His deep-set eyes crinkled at the corners, and for a brief moment I noticed the confidence in his stance. "Here to fix your problem." "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him in. As he walked past me, the faint scent of sawdust and leather followed him, grounding and familiar. Mark wasted no time getting to work, chatting lightly as he examined the faulty light fixture. He asked me how long it had been flickering, joked about the quirks of older homes, and somehow, effortlessly, the conversation drifted to more personal topics. I told him about the house, about how my husband and I had moved in 5 years ago, full of dreams and plans. Now it felt like a place I occupied alone. "You don't have family close by?" he asked, glancing down from the ladder as he adjusted a wire. "No, just my husband, really. He travels a lot for work," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. He nodded knowingly, as if he understood more than I had said. "That's tough. My ex-wife used to complain about the hours I worked, too." "Oh," I murmured, unsure how to respond. The air between us felt charged, though I couldn't say why. I chalked it up to the odd intimacy of sharing a space with a stranger. The next day, I found myself thinking about Mark more than I cared to admit. His voice, his easy manner, the way he seemed to see through the cracks I worked so hard to conceal. It all stayed with me, lingering like the faint scent of his cologne. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting thought born out of loneliness. But when he called to say he needed to come back to finish the job, my heart leapt in a way that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. "Hey there," Mark said when I opened the door again. His smile was the same, but there was something different in his gaze, something that lingered just a moment too long. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside. "I hope it wasn't too much trouble to come back." "And you are so handsome." "No trouble at all," he said, setting his toolbox down. I'd never leave a job half-finished. He got to work quickly, but this time the conversation flowed differently. It felt more personal, more deliberate. He asked me about my hobbies, what I did for work, even what books I liked to read. And I found myself asking him questions too, about his work, his life, his past. I was surprised by how easy it was to talk to him, how much I wanted to keep talking. As he stood on the ladder, reaching up to adjust the fixture, his shirt lifted slightly. revealing a hint of tanned skin above his waistband. I looked away quickly, embarrassed by my wandering thoughts. But when he came down, his eyes caught mine, and for a split second, it felt like he knew. "All set," he said, packing up his tools. "Let me know if you need anything else fixed around here." "Thanks, Mark," I said, trying to sound casual. But as I closed the door behind him, I realized my hands were trembling. And the days that followed were a blur of routine tasks and restless nights. I tried to focus on work, on chores, on anything that would distract me from the strange, unfamiliar pull I felt toward Mark. But nothing worked. I replayed our conversations in my mind, dissecting every word, every glance. And when the light in the hallway started flickering, I didn't hesitate to call him. When he arrived, it felt different this time. There was a familiarity between us now, an unspoken understanding that neither of us acknowledged. He worked efficiently, as always, but the silences between our words were heavier, laden with possibilities that I was too afraid to name. As he finished up, he leaned against the doorframe, his eyes meeting mine with a steadiness that made my stomach flip. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for." I blinked, caught off guard. "What makes you say that?" He shrugged, his gaze never wavering. "Takes a lot of strength to hold things together when they feel like they're falling apart." His words hit me harder than I expected. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Mark. That's kind of you to say." He nodded, his eyes softening. "Take care, all right?" As he left, I stood in the doorway, watching him walk away, and for the first time in years, I felt something I couldn't ignore, a spark, a possibility, a dangerous pull towards something I knew I shouldn't want. As I stood, I felt Matt's hand on my back. The next time Mark came over, it wasn't because something was broken. The light in the hallway had been working perfectly since his last visit, but I called him anyway, pretending there was a problem with the kitchen outlet. It was a flimsy excuse, and I knew it. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing need to see him again, to feel that pull that made my pulse quicken. He arrived late in the afternoon, dressed in the same work uniform, his tool belt slung casually around his waist. He greeted me with a smile that seemed to linger a beat too long, and I felt my breath hit. "Kitchen, right?" he asked, stepping inside. I nodded, suddenly feeling foolish for calling him over under false pretenses. "Yes, it's acting up again." He raised an eyebrow but didn't press me for details. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, his presence filling the space in a way that made it feel smaller, more intimate. As he crouched by the outlet, testing the wires, I leaned against the counter, pretending to busy myself with a magazine, but my eyes kept drifting back to him, his hands, his shoulders, the way he moved with quiet confidence. I wondered if he could sense my gaze, if he knew the effect he was having on me. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "you really call an electrician every time an outlet flickers?" I froze, the magazine slipping slightly from my hands. "What do you mean?" He turned to look at me, a teasing smile playing on his lips. "I mean, you're starting to give me the impression you just like having me around." The air between us shifted, thick with something unspoken. My cheeks burned, and I looked away, desperately searching for a way to diffuse the moment. "Well," I said, forcing a laugh, "you're good at what you do." He chuckled, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "That's not the only reason, is it?" His words hung in the air, daring me to respond, but I couldn't. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I turned back to the counter, pretending to sort through the mail, but my hands were trembling. Mark stood up, brushing off his hands. "All fixed," he said, his tone lighter now. "You should be good to go." "Thanks," I mumbled, keeping my eyes on the counter. I was too afraid to look at him, afraid of what I might see. He kept tugging. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. His words, his smile, the way he had looked at me. It was all too much. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering dangerously close to falling. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with him, his hands, his voice, the way he had made me feel seen, like I wasn't just another piece of furniture in the house. I woke up breathless, my heart racing, and I knew I was in trouble. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't call him again. I needed to focus on my marriage, on fixing the cracks that had formed between my husband and me. But when Mark texted me, just a simple, "Hope everything's working okay," I felt that familiar pull. Before I knew it, I was typing back, "Everything's fine, but if you're in the area, I could use some help moving a few things." It was a lie, of course, but I didn't care. Mark arrived an hour later, his truck rumbling up the driveway. He stepped out, his smile easy and warm, but there was something different in his eyes, something that mirrored the restless energy I felt in my chest. "All right," he said, stepping inside. "What are we moving?" I hesitated, realizing I hadn't thought this through. Just a few boxes in the garage," I said, leading him toward the back of the house. The garage was cluttered with half-unpacked boxes and old furniture, a chaotic reminder of how much I had let things slide since my husband started traveling more. Mark surveyed the space, then turned to me with a smirk. "You weren't kidding about needing help," he said. I laughed, the sound nervous and too loud. "Yeah, it's been a while since we've had time to organize." He nodded, picking up a box and moving it effortlessly to the side. I watched him, my eyes tracing the lines of his arms, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders. The air felt heavy again, charged with the same tension that had been building between us. As he set the box down, he turned to me, his eyes meeting mine. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, but my voice betrayed me. It was too soft, too shaky. He stepped closer, his brow furrowed with concern. "You seem, I don't know, different." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling at my sides, and then before I could stop myself, I took a step closer to him. "Mark," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes searched mine, and in that moment, I knew he felt it too. That pull, that undeniable connection that had been building between us since the moment we met. Time seemed to slow as he reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His hand lingered for just a moment too long, his fingers grazing my cheek. I felt a shiver run through me, my breath catching in my throat. And then, as if the world itself was holding its breath, he stepped back. "Doesn't it hurt you, do? I should go," he said, his voice tight. I nodded, unable to speak, unable to move. The next few days felt like a waking dream, one where I couldn't escape the intensity of my own thoughts. I replayed every moment in the garage, his touch, the look in his eyes, the way he had stepped back before the invisible line between us could be crossed. I knew it was wrong to want more, but that didn't stop the ache that had taken root deep within me. When Mark texted again, asking if everything was okay, I hesitated before responding. I typed out half a dozen messages before settling on, "Everything's fine, thanks for checking." I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the send button, but before I could convince myself to delete the message, another text from him appeared. "Can I stop by, just to make sure?" My heart raced as I read his words. There was no reason for him to come back. Nothing in the house was broken, nothing needed fixing. But I didn't stop myself from replying, "Sure, if you're in the area." When he arrived, it was early evening, and the golden light of the setting sun spilled through the windows, casting the living room in a warm glow. I opened the door, and for a moment we just stood there, neither of us saying anything. His presence filled the doorway, his silhouette framed by the fading sunlight. "Hey," he said finally, his voice soft. "Hey," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He walked into the living room, his gaze sweeping over the space before landing on me. "You sure everything's fine?" he asked, a hint of something unspoken in his tone. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Yeah, I guess I could use the company." It was an admission I hadn't planned to make, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. But Mark didn't seem surprised. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what I meant. "I get that," he said, sitting down on the edge of the sofa. "Sometimes it feels like the walls are closing in, doesn't it?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "Yeah, exactly." For a while we just sat there, the silence between us comfortable yet charged. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound, a low, steady backdrop to the tension that seemed to thrum in the air. "Sweat a little." "You don't talk about him much," Mark said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. I glanced at him, startled. "Who?" "Your husband." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "There's not much to say," I said finally. "He works a lot. He's gone most of the time." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That must be hard." "It is," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just here, waiting for him to come back, and when he does, it's like he's still somewhere else." Mark didn't say anything, but his eyes never left mine. There was something in his gaze, an understanding, a quiet compassion that made me feel exposed yet seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "You deserve more than that." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I looked away, my heart pounding. "It's not that simple." "Oh, maybe it should be," he said, his voice firm but gentle. I swallowed hard, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. Part of me wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave and never come back. But another part, a part I didn't want to admit existed, wanted him to stay. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't know what I'm doing." He reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. The touch was so simple, so innocent, yet it sent a jolt through me. I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked up at him, my breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. "You're not alone," he said, his voice low. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world outside the room faded away, leaving only the two of us and the weight of everything unsaid. Mm. Mark, I can't, I started, but my voice faltered, and my voice faltered. He leaned in, his gaze never leaving mine. You don't have to say anything. And then, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was tentative at first, a hesitant meeting of lips that seemed to hold all the tension and longing that had been building between us. But as the seconds passed, it deepened, growing more urgent, more desperate. His hands cupped my face, his touch warm and grounding, while mine found their way to his shoulders, gripping him like he was the only solid thing in a world that was spinning out of control. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, he rested his forehead against mine, his hand still cradling my face. I held my breath. He squeezed my ears as though he drowned in the sigh. I shouldn't have done that, he said, his voice thick with regret. I know, I whispered, my own voice shaky. But I don't regret it. Exhale. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. What happens now? I don't know, I admitted. But I can't pretend this didn't happen. Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. Neither can I. For a moment we just sat there, the weight of what we had done settling over us. And then, as if by unspoken agreement, he stood. I should go, he said, his voice rough. I nodded, unable to speak. He hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but then he turned and walked to the door. As the door closed behind him, I sank back onto the sofa, my heart heavy with the knowledge that everything had changed. The days following Mark's departure felt surreal, like I was walking through a haze. My mind replayed that kiss over and over, each detail etched into my memory. The warmth of his hands, the way his lips pressed against mine, the unspoken promise in his touch. I should have felt guilt consuming me, but instead there was something darker, something more dangerous, a yearning I couldn't suppress. I kept waiting for the flood of regret, for the voice in my head to scream that I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. But the regret didn't come. Instead, I found myself checking my phone more often, hoping for another text from Mark. My stomach twisted each time it buzzed, only to sink with disappointment when it wasn't him. 3 days later, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, my phone buzzed again. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and glanced at the screen. It was him. Mark, I can't stop thinking about the other night. We need to talk. My heart raced as I read his words. My hands trembled as I typed a reply. I can't stop thinking about it either. I stared at the screen, my breath catching as 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. The suspense was unbearable, and just as I was about to put the phone down, another message came through. Mark, can I see you? The question hung in the air like a lifeline, and before I could overthink it, I typed back, yes. Mark arrived that evening. I didn't even bother with the pretense of needing something fixed this time. He knocked on the door, and when I opened it, the look in his eyes said everything we hadn't put into words. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and we stood there for a moment, caught in the gravity of our decision. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Hi, he replied, his tone equally soft. The silence between us was heavy, charged with the weight of everything we were about to do. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver down my spine. I shouldn't be here, he said, his voice tight, but I couldn't stay away. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I didn't want you to stay away. He closed the gap between us, his hand cupping my cheek as he leaned in. The kiss this time was different, less hesitant, more certain. It was the kind of kiss that left no room for doubt, that erased the world outside the two of us. The sofa where I had spent countless lonely evenings became the stage for something I never thought I'd experience again. Passion that left me breathless, a connection so intense it felt like a lifeline. Mark's touch was both gentle and urgent, his hands tracing lines along my skin that reignited something inside me I thought had been long extinguished. For hours we existed in a world of our own, where the rules and boundaries of reality didn't apply. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, his every word, every touch, reminding me of the woman I used to be, the woman I had lost somewhere along the way. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, he rested his forehead against mine, his hand lingering on my arm. "This is insane," he murmured. "We're going to get caught." I nodded, my chest tightening at the thought. "I know, but I can't stop." I removed my— "Neither can I," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. As the days turned into weeks, Mark and I found ways to steal moments together. Quiet afternoons when my husband was out of town, whispered phone calls late at night, even fleeting touches in the crowded aisles of the local hardware store. Every encounter felt like a rebellion against the monotony of my life, a spark that kept me going when everything else felt dull and lifeless. But with every secret meeting, the risk grew. My husband's business trips were becoming shorter, and the guilt I had managed to suppress began to creep in. Every time I saw him, the weight of what I was doing pressed down on me, threatening to suffocate me. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Mark had become my escape, my salvation, the one thing that made me feel alive. The turning point came one evening when my husband unexpectedly called to say he was coming home early. I froze, the phone slipping from my hand as panic set in. Mark was in the house, and there was no time to hide what we had been doing. I rushed into the living room where Mark was sitting on the sofa, his shirt unbuttoned and his hair slightly tousled. He looked up at me, concern flickering in his eyes. "He's on his way," I said, my voice trembling. Mark stood immediately, buttoning his shirt. "I'll go out the back," he said, his voice calm despite the tension in the air. I nodded, my heart pounding as I led him to the back door. He paused before stepping out, his hand brushing against mine. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice low. "This can't keep happening like this." "I know," I whispered, my chest tightening, "but I don't know how to stop." Mark didn't respond. He just looked at me for a moment, his expression a mix of longing and regret, before slipping out the door and disappearing into the night. When my husband walked through the front door minutes later, I plastered on a smile, hoping he wouldn't notice the tension in my voice or the flush in my cheeks. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, his expression tired but warm, and for a moment I thought I had gotten away with it. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. My double life was beginning to unravel, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The unraveling began with a single innocuous question. We were sitting at the dinner table, my husband and I, sharing an unusually quiet meal. He set down his fork, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, and asked, "Have you been okay lately?" The question caught me off guard, my heart skipping a beat. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, his gaze lingering on me longer than usual. "I don't know. You just seem different, distracted." His words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on me like a physical force. I forced another smile, this one tighter. Oh, work has been stressful, I guess. He nodded slowly, but his expression didn't change. I could feel his eyes on me for the rest of the meal, and I couldn't help but wonder if he knew, if he could sense the growing divide between us, the secrets I was hiding. The next time Mark and I met, the tension between us was palpable. We had become adept at sneaking around, finding stolen moments where we could, but the risk of being discovered was starting to take its toll. I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this, Mark said as he paced the living room. His voice was low, but the frustration in it was unmistakable. I sat on the sofa, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I know, I said quietly, but I don't know how to stop, Maggie said. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression softening. You deserve to be happy, he said, his voice gentler now. But it's not sustainable. I know, I said again, my voice barely above a whisper, but I don't know how to let you go. Mark crossed the room and knelt in front of me, taking my hands in his. You're stronger than you think, he said. You don't need me to save you. Tears filled my eyes and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. But I need you, I admitted, my voice breaking. You're the only thing keeping me afloat. He sighed, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. And I need you, he said, but this is going to destroy us both. It made me sick. The first crack came when my husband found the receipt. It was a small thing, barely worth noticing, a crumpled piece of paper from a local coffee shop tucked into the corner of my purse. But it wasn't mine. Mark had paid for coffee during one of our clandestine meetings, and the receipt had somehow ended up in my bag. What's this? My husband asked, holding it up. My heart stopped. Oh, that, I said quickly, snatching it from his hand. I grabbed coffee with a friend the other day. His brow furrowed. You didn't mention that. To his surprise, it was last minute, I said, my voice too casual, nothing worth mentioning. He nodded slowly, but the suspicion in his eyes was clear. He didn't press further, but I could feel the shift in the air between us. The foundation of my carefully constructed double life was beginning to crack. Things came to a head one evening when my husband returned home earlier than expected. I was in the living room with Mark, the two of us standing too close, our voices hushed. We hadn't heard the car pull into the driveway, hadn't heard the front door open. What's going on here? My husband's voice cut through the room like a blade. I froze, my heart pounding as I turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, his eyes darting between Mark and me, his expression a mix of confusion and anger. Who is this? He demanded, his gaze landing on Mark. Mark stepped forward, his posture tense but calm. I'm the electrician, he said. I was just finishing up a job. My husband's eyes narrowed. At this hour? At this hour? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I could see the realization dawning in his eyes. Is this why you've been acting so strange? He asked, his voice rising. Is this why you've been so distant? No, I said quickly, stepping toward him. It's not what you think. But the damage was done. My husband's expression hardened, and he turned to Mark. You need to leave, now. Mark hesitated, his eyes flicking to me before nodding. I'm sorry, he said quietly before walking out the door. That night was the longest of my life. My husband and I sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he asked finally, his voice cold. I hesitated, my mind racing. I could deny everything, try to salvage what was left of our marriage, but I was tired of lying, tired of the guilt and the secrets. I made a mistake," I said, my voice trembling. "I never meant for it to happen, but it did." His expression didn't change, but I could see the pain in his eyes. "How long?" he asked. "Not long," I said. It wasn't serious." He laughed bitterly. "Not serious. You risked everything for something that wasn't serious." Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. "I'm sorry," I said. "I know I hurt you. I hate myself for it." He stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I need some time," he said. "I don't know if I can forgive this." As he walked out of the room, I felt a crushing weight settle over me. The life I had built, the marriage I had fought to preserve, was crumbling before my eyes. The house was quiet after my husband left the room, but the silence felt louder than any argument we could have had. I sat on the sofa, staring at my hands, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. My chest ached with the enormity of what I had done, the trust I had shattered. Hours passed before I moved, my limbs heavy as I dragged myself to the bedroom. The bed we had shared for years now felt foreign, as though the betrayal had seeped into its very fabric. I curled up on one side, staring at the empty space where he should have been, wondering if I had ruined everything beyond repair. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the front door closing. Panic shot through me as I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the living room. My husband was standing by the door, his suitcase in hand. "You're leaving?" I asked, my voice trembling. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "I need some space," he said. "I can't be here right now." Tears filled my eyes as I stepped closer. "Please don't go. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I don't know if we can fix this. You lied to me. You betrayed me. I don't even know who you are anymore." His words cut deeper than I thought possible, and I felt my knees weaken. "I'm still me," I said desperately. "I made a mistake, but I love you. I've always loved you." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. "If that were true, you wouldn't have done this," he said quietly, before turning and walking out the door. Days turned into weeks, and the emptiness in the house grew unbearable. My husband hadn't called, and I didn't dare reach out, afraid of what he might say, or worse, what he might not say. The life we had built together felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Mark texted once, a simple message asking if I was okay. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours before replying, "I don't know." Oh, his response came quickly. "You know, I'm here if you need to talk." I wanted to talk to him, to lean on him the way I had before, but I knew it wasn't fair to him or to myself. I needed to face the consequences of my actions alone, to figure out who I was and what I wanted. One evening, as I was cleaning out the garage, I found an old photo album tucked away in a dusty box. I flipped through the pages, each photo a reminder of the life my husband and I had shared. The vacations, the holidays, the quiet moments that had once seemed so ordinary, but now felt extraordinary in their simplicity. Tears blurred my vision as I realized how much I had taken for granted. I had been so consumed by my loneliness, so desperate for connection, that I had overlooked the love that had been there all along. My husband wasn't perfect, and neither was I, but we had built something real, something worth fighting for. I closed the album and sat there in the dim light of the garage, the weight of my mistakes pressing down on me. I didn't know if I could fix what I had broken, but I knew I had to try. Sightlessly, I smiled, trying to see what lay before me. A week later, I mustered the courage to call my husband. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice cautious. "Hello? It's me," I said, my voice shaky. "I was wondering if we could talk." There was a long pause before he replied. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "Please," I said, my heart pounding. "Just hear me out." He sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion. "Okay, I'll come by tomorrow." When he arrived the next day, the tension between us was palpable. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence stretching out like a chasm. Finally, I spoke. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am for what I did." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the table. "I was lonely," I continued, tears streaming down my face. "But that's not an excuse. I should have talked to you, should have told you how I was feeling, instead of betraying you." His eyes lifted to meet mine, and I saw the pain etched into his face. "Why didn't you?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you just tell me?" "I was afraid," I admitted. "Afraid that it wouldn't change anything, that you'd still be gone all the time, and I'd still feel alone. But I know now that I should have tried. I should have fought for us." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I don't know if I can trust you again," he said quietly. "Every time I look at you, I see him." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the tears come harder. "I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust," I said. "I'll wait as long as you need. Just please don't give up on us." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know if it's possible," he said finally, "but I'm willing to try." The days that followed were difficult, filled with long conversations and painful truths. Rebuilding our marriage was like learning to walk again. Slow, unsteady, and filled with moments of doubt. But with each step, I felt the weight of my mistakes lifting, replaced by a fragile hope. Mark and I never spoke again. I knew that chapter of my life had to stay closed if I wanted to move forward. He had been a lifeline when I needed one, but he wasn't the answer to the questions I had been too afraid to face. In the end, I learned that love isn't perfect. It's messy and complicated and filled with mistakes. But if it's real, it's worth fighting for, even when it feels like the fight might break you.